The church had been on Clement Street since 1923. Greater Calvary African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded on a Tuesday in March of 1923 in the year that the Harmon County AME District had approved the charter for a new congregation on the south side of the city, and the congregation had met for 11 months in the basement of the Redeemer Baptist Church on Holloway Street before the building on Clement Street was completed, and the first service was held in it on a Sunday in February of 1924. Marcus Elijah Tatum's grandfather. Deacon Ezra Tatum had been one of the 7 founding members who had signed the charter application in March of 1923. He had been 34 years old. He had worked at the Harmon County Foundry for 9 years and had been a deacon at Redeemer Baptist for 6 years before the split that produced Greater Calvary, and he had put $400 of foundry wages into the building fund for the Clement Street property, which was $400 in 1923. Which was a thing that a man who worked at a foundry for $9 a week did not do lightly. Ezra Tatum had died in 1971. He had been 82 years old. He had been a deacon of Greater Calvary AME for 48 years. His grandson Marcus had been 9 years old when Ezra died. He remembered the funeral. He remembered the way the church looked with the deacon's family in the front pews and the congregation filling the rest of the sanctuary, and the way the light came through the east windows on a September morning. He remembered thinking in the specific 9-year-old way of understanding that something important was happening, without fully understanding what that importance contained, that the church was very full. He had not yet understood that someday it would be his. What he had understood at 9 years old was that the church was a place where people gathered to do something that required their full presence. He had understood this the way children understand things that are larger than their current vocabulary, not through the words for it, but through the experience of sitting in the pew and feeling the quality of the room around him. The hymns were one thing. The sermon was another thing. But the thing he had felt, even at 9, even at 6, was the quality of the room itself, when it was full of people who had come to be in the room together, which was a different quality from any other full room he had ever been in. He had spent the rest of his life trying to maintain that quality. He had spent 32 years at one pulpit doing it. He believed in the way that a person believes something that has been tested by 32 years of evidence, that he had not been wrong. Sorry? Marcus Elijah Tatum was 67 years old. He had been born in Harmon County in the summer of 1957, the third of 4 children born to Harold and Eunice Tatum, who had lived on Macon Street in the South Side neighborhood that the Tatum family had occupied for 30 years before Marcus arrived. Harold Tatum worked at the postal sorting facility for 26 years. Eunice Tatum was a school librarian for 31 years at the Clement Street Elementary School, which was 4 blocks from Greater Calvary, and which had been the school that Marcus and his siblings attended. Marcus had grown up in the church, not in the way that many people describe their childhood church attendance, meaning that they were brought to services by parents who required it. He had grown up in the church in the specific sense that the church was a place he chose. He had gone on Wednesday evenings for youth group, even when it was not required, had helped Deacon Bridges' predecessor, a man named Calvin Shorter, with the outreach pantry on Saturday mornings, beginning when Marcus was 14, had sung in the junior choir for 6 years, before his voice had changed, and then continued with the senior choir for 2 more years before he had understood gradually and then clearly that what he was meant to do in this church was not to sing in it. He had told his parents at 17 that he intended to go to seminary. His father had said, "You're sure?" He had said, "I'm sure." His father had said, "Then we'll figure out how to pay for it." They had figured it out. Eunice Tatum had worked additional shifts at the library during the summers. Harold Tatum had driven for a car service on weekends for 3 years. Marcus had worked construction during his summers home from Howard University and had sent the money home. He had graduated from Howard University School of Divinity in 1982 with a Master of Divinity degree. The 5 years at Howard had been the first time he had lived outside of Harmon County, and the first time he had been in a place where the ambient context of his daily life was not defined by the South Side neighborhood where he had grown up. Washington, D.C. in 1977 was not Harmon County, Ohio in 1977. Howard University in 1977 was not anywhere else he had been. The intellectual and spiritual community of the Divinity School. The conversations that began in the classrooms and continued in the hallways and in the cafeteria and in the small apartments where the students gathered in the evenings had shaped the way he thought about the pastoral work in ways he was still discovering 30 years later. He had been particularly formed by a professor named Dr. James Lawton, who taught systematic theology, and who had the specific quality of a teacher who does not give you what to think, but teaches you the practice of thinking, so that you leave the course able to do the thing yourself. Lawton had told him in his final year, "You know where you're going. Go there. Do the work. The work is the whole thing." He had been 25 years old. He had met Celestine Amara Williams in his second year at Howard at a university event where she had been present as a nursing student at Howard's College of Nursing. She had been 22 years old and had the specific alert quality of a person who is paying close attention to everything around her without appearing to be doing so. He had noticed her noticing things. He had found a reason to speak to her. They had married in 1984 in the chapel at Howard in a ceremony attended by both families, including Harold and Eunice Tatum, who had driven from Harmon County, and the Reverend Isaiah Douglas, who had driven from Harmon County as well, because Douglas had known Marcus since he was a boy in the pews and had wanted to be there when the boy married. Douglas had told Marcus at the reception, "Bring her home when you're ready. We'll be waiting." He had served 3 years at a rural congregation in East Tennessee before returning to Harmon County in 1985 when the Reverend Isaiah Douglas, who had been Greater Calvary's senior pastor for 27 years, had retired and the congregation had called Marcus to fill the position. He had been 28 years old when he took the pulpit at Greater Calvary. He had been there for 32 years since then. The church that he had returned to in 1985 was not precisely the church that Ezra Tatum had helped found in 1923, in the sense that 61 years had changed the congregation and the building and the neighborhood around it. But it was precisely the church that Ezra Tatum had helped found in the sense that mattered. The charter was the same charter. The building was the same building on the same street. And the community that gathered in it was the community that had been gathering in it through 6 decades of Harmon County's life, which included the decades when Harmon County had been the kind of place it was then, which was a different kind of place than it was in 1985, but not so different that the church's purpose had changed. The church's purpose was the same in 1985 as it had been in 1923, which was the same as it was now, which was to be a place where the people of this community could come to be held. Marcus had understood this at 28. He had understood it better at 67. The 32 years between had been the process of understanding it. What 32 years at one pulpit looks like from the outside is a long tenure. What it looks like from the inside is a specific accumulated knowledge of a community that cannot be obtained any other way. The knowledge of who was born and who died and who married, whom and who left for college and who came back and who stayed and who fell ill and who recovered and who did not. And the specific pastoral knowledge of what people carry that they do not speak about in ordinary life and that they bring in ordinary life to the pastor. Marcus Tatum had officiated at 411 funerals in 32 years. He had officiated at 237 weddings. He had visited 318 hospital rooms. He had not counted these things himself. Deacon Harold Bridges had counted them because Bridges was the kind of deacon who maintained records. He had shown the count to Marcus on the occasion of Marcus's 30th anniversary at Greater Calvary 2 years ago, printed on a piece of paper in the deacon's careful handwriting, and Marcus had looked at the numbers and had understood that they were not meant to impress him, but to remind him of what 30 years of presence looked like when it was counted. Bridges had been at Greater Calvary for 28 years. He had come as a young man of 43 and had been a deacon for the entirety of those 28 years and had known Marcus for all of them. He was 71 years old and had the specific, unhurried manner of a man who has done a serious thing for a long time and who has no need to demonstrate the seriousness of the thing to anyone. He had been standing on the church steps on that particular Sunday morning. He had seen everything. Marcus Tatum had published one book. It was a work of liberation theology, titled The Threshold of Presence, a pastoral theology of the marginalized community, published by Vanderbilt University Press in 2009, after 5 years of writing it in the evenings after his pastoral duties were complete. He had written it in the study at the back of the church at a desk that had been in the study since Reverend Douglas's tenure, which was a large oak desk with a specific reliable solidity that Marcus had associated for 32 years with the work of thinking. The book had been reviewed in the Journal of Religious Ethics and the African American Pulpit. He had been invited to lecture at 3 seminary programs: Vanderbilt Divinity School, Howard University School of Divinity, and the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. He had done each of the lectures, driving to 2 of them and flying to the 3rd, and he had returned each time to Harmon County and to the Clement Street Church, and to the desk in the study and to the Sunday morning service that was the center of what he did. He had returned not because the lectures were not worthwhile. They were worthwhile, he believed that, but because the lecture hall was not where his work was. His work was here in this building with this congregation in this community, on this specific street in this specific county where his grandfather had signed a charter in 1923. That was where his work was. The lectures were a kind of generosity the work allowed him to offer outward. The work itself was on Clement Street. He had never been confused about this. Some people who had achieved recognition in their field became confused about the difference between the recognition and the work. He had watched it happen to people he respected. He had been determined not to let it happen to him, and it had not happened partly because of his own discipline, and partly because Celestine had been very clear at every stage of his career about the difference between the two and about which one she thought mattered. She had thought the work mattered. She had been right. He had been a member of the Harmon County Interfaith Council since 1998. He had served as council chair for 3 terms. The Interfaith Council had been the place where he had done some of the most difficult work of his professional life, which was the work of holding a coalition of religious communities together through the specific recurring moments when they disagreed in ways that mattered. He had done it because the alternative fragmentation, the retreat of each community into its own singular perspective, was worse than the difficulty of the work, and because he believed from 30 years of pastoral experience that communities which do not know each other cannot serve each other, and that not knowing each other was a choice, not a circumstance. He had served as council chair through the year when a proposed development on the south side of Harmon County had divided the religious community along lines that largely tracked race and class. He had not pretended the division was not there. He had convened the meetings, named the division explicitly, and asked the council to work through it rather than around it. They had worked through it. It had taken 14 months. The development had ultimately been modified in ways that incorporated more of the South Side community's concerns. He did not know whether his chairmanship had mattered to that outcome. He knew it had mattered to the 14 months. The current council chair, a woman named Rabbi Sarah Feldman, who had led a congregation on the east side of the county for 11 years, had called Marcus the day after the incident on the church steps to say that the council would be filing its own letter with the department if Marcus wanted that support. He had said yes, thank you. She had filed it the following morning. It was in the file that Deacon Bridges had organized. He had received the Harmon County Civic Achievement Award in 2014 from the county executive at a ceremony that Greater Calvary had attended in force 40 members of the congregation. Deacon Bridges in his deacon suit, Sister Estelle Norwood at 83, the choir director Vanessa Polk. He had thanked the county executive and had gone back to Clement Street and had prepared his Sunday sermon. He had not thought of the award as particularly significant. He had thought of it as the community's way of acknowledging that the church had been present in the community for a long time, which was true, and that the pastor of a church that had been present for a long time was going to accumulate the kind of recognition that comes from sustained presence. He had accepted the recognition on behalf of the church and the congregation, which was the correct way to accept it, because the recognition was not for him specifically. It was for what he had been part of, which was larger than him and had been present before him and would be present after him. Deacon Bridges had kept a copy of the award citation in the church's administrative files, alongside the charter documents from 1923 and the renovation plans from 2015 and the photograph of Reverend Douglas at his retirement in 1985 and the 40-year photograph of the congregation taken in 1964. The church had been present for 101 years. Celestine Ruth Tatum had died 5 years ago on a Thursday in April in the Harmon County General Hospital after a cancer that she had managed for 3 years, and that she had managed with the specific practical courage of a woman who understood that the management of illness was a form of work, and who had done the work completely until the week she could no longer do it. She had been a registered nurse for 29 years at Harmon County General. She had worked in the oncology unit for the last 14 of those years, which meant that she had understood her own illness in the specific clinical way of a nurse who has held the hands of patients with the same diagnosis, and who has no illusions about what the diagnosis contains. She had not wanted illusions. She had wanted honesty, and Marcus had given it to her, and they had spent the 3 years of her illness doing what they had done for the 31 years before it, which was being honest with each other about what was happening and about what mattered. She had asked him in the last week to promise her that he would keep going to the hospital visits and the funerals and the steps on Sunday morning. He had said, "Celestine, I always." She had said, "Promise me." He had said, "I promise." She had said, "Good. Now stop sitting there looking like that and talk to me about something that isn't this." He had talked to her about Raymond's children, who were 2 and 4 at the time, and who had visited 2 weeks before, and who had been in the specific way of 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds, entirely indifferent to the weight of the occasion, and entirely delightful because of it. He had talked about the new drainage project on the south side of the county that was going to, if the engineering held, redirect water in a way that would reduce the flooding on Clement Street that happened every heavy spring rain. He had talked about Deacon Bridges and the new outreach program that Bridges was developing, and that was going to require a van, and whether the church budget could accommodate a van. She had listened. She had died on a Thursday morning quietly in the way that she had done most things. He had been in the room. He had kept the promise. He was still keeping it. He still wore his wedding ring. He had worn it for 36 years, and he was going to wear it for however many years remained. He had not thought about removing it. The ring was part of what his life was, and his life had not changed in the way that would require removing it. Their son Raymond was 38 years old and taught history at Harmon County High School and had 2 children, a girl named Celestine for her grandmother, and a boy named Harold for his 2 grandfathers. They came to church when they were in Harmon County, which was most Sundays. Their daughter Imani was 35 years old and worked as a public health researcher at Emory University in Atlanta. She called every Sunday after the service. They had known their parents' church their whole lives. They knew the building and the congregation and the specific smell of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings and the way their father stood on the front steps after the service and greeted the departing congregation, which was the thing he had done every Sunday for 32 years. The standing on the steps was not incidental. It was a practice that Reverend Douglas had maintained before Marcus, that Douglas's predecessor had maintained before Douglas, and that Marcus had continued not because it was required by the tradition, but because it was right. Douglas had told Marcus about it during the transition, not as an instruction, but as an observation. He had said, "I've learned more on those steps than I've learned in many months of visiting. People say things in the threshold that they can't say inside and can't say on the street. The steps are something particular." Marcus had understood what Douglas meant within his first year at the pulpit. He had understood it in the specific way of a young pastor who is learning something he has been told is true by someone older, and who discovers through his own experience that it is true, and in fact is truer than the older person was able to convey in the telling. It was a practice that Reverend Douglas had maintained before Marcus, and that Marcus had continued not because it was required by the tradition, but because it was right. It was the visible practice of the pastor's availability, the pastor standing at the threshold at the place where the sacred space of the sanctuary met the street, so that any member of the congregation who needed to speak could speak in that moment of transition. He had learned things on those steps that he would not have learned otherwise. He had noticed in that moment of transition the hesitations and the expressions and the body language of people who would not have sought him out inside the sanctuary, but who on the steps in the brief moment of passage said what they needed to say. He had been on those steps every Sunday for 32 years. He had been on them in August heat and in February cold and in the rain when he stood under the small overhang of the door with his umbrella and still greeted each person as they came through. He had been on them when Celestine was in the hospital, and when Celestine had died, and on the first Sunday after the funeral, when he had put on his clerical collar and walked to Clement Street and stood on the steps because the promise he had made her was a promise, and the steps were where it needed to be kept. He had never counted the Sundays. Deacon Bridges had. 32 years of Sundays was 1,664 Sundays. He had stood on those steps 1,664 times. The service on that Sunday had begun at 10:30 and concluded at 12:17. It had been a Sunday in October, the specific October Sunday, when the light in Harmon County changes from the bright, direct quality of September to the lower, warmer quality of the months before winter, and the light through the east windows of the sanctuary had been that October light throughout the service. Marcus had preached for 35 minutes on the text from the book of Ruth, "Wherever you go, I will go." He had been preparing that particular sermon for 3 weeks, because the text and the congregation's current season had aligned in a way that made it the right one, and when a text was the right one for a moment, he spent more time with it than usual reading the commentary and sitting with the specific language of the passage until he knew what it was asking him to say. He had preached it in the direction of the congregation's several situations of loss and transition that autumn, a family whose patriarch had died in August, 2 young adults who had left for new positions in other cities, the ongoing illness of Sister Estelle Norwood's daughter, who lived in Cleveland, and whose treatments were not going as the family had hoped. He had said, "The commitment to presence is not contingent on comfort. It is the commitment itself that is the comfort." The congregation had been present in the way that a congregation is present when the sermon is speaking to something they are carrying. He had felt it, which was a thing that could not be described to someone who had not preached for 32 years, the specific quality of a congregation's attention when the sermon has found what it was looking for. He had closed with prayer. The choir had sung. The service had ended at 12:17. He had put on his clerical collar that he had removed during the sermon's more animated passages and had walked to the back of the church and through the narthex and out through the front doors and down the 3 steps to the place where he stood every Sunday. He had begun greeting the congregation. Sister Estelle Norwood was the first one out, as she usually was, because she sat in the second pew on the left side, which was where she had sat for 41 years. And because at 78 she moved at the pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and who does not hurry for anyone. He had said Estelle. She had said that was for Margaret. "Thank you." He had said it was for everyone. She had patted his hand and moved down the steps. The vehicle that Officer Dylan Pruitt observed when he turned onto Clement Street at 12:23 was a white minivan that had double parked in front of the church while its driver, a member of the congregation named Theodore Hicks, went back inside to retrieve a casserole dish that he had brought for the post-service fellowship meal and had left in the kitchen. Theodore Hicks had been inside the church for 90 seconds when Pruitt's cruiser arrived. Pruitt was 24 years old. He had been with the Harmon County Sheriff's Department for 16 months. He had completed the department's standard field training program, which had included a module on community policing and a module on non-emergency call response protocols. He had passed both. He had been assessed as competent in field judgment by his training officer, A sergeant named Boyd, who had 8 years on the force and who had noted in Pruitt's evaluation that he responded well to direct instruction and that he needed to develop more situational patience. The note about situational patience had been in the evaluation. He had been assigned to the Clement Street Area Patrol for 4 months, which was the patrol rotation that covered the South Side commercial and residential area that included the Clement Street corridor. He had driven past Greater Calvary AME Church on multiple occasions during his 4 months on the patrol. He had not noted the church's name or the denomination or the schedule of services. He had noted that on Sunday mornings there was often street congestion on Clement Street in the midday hours. He had not connected the congestion to the church. He had turned onto Clement Street at 12:23. He had observed the double-parked minivan. He had observed the church building. He had not read the sign. He had not noted the denomination marker above the door, or the cross on the building's face, or the clerical collar on the man at the top of the steps. He had noted double-parked vehicle black man on steps. He had observed a black man in dark clothing standing on the steps of the building in front of the minivan. He had pulled over. He had gotten out of his vehicle. He had approached the man on the steps. He had said, "Hey, you need to move this van." The man on the steps had turned. The man on the steps was wearing a black clerical shirt with a clerical collar. He was wearing a small silver cross on a chain at the collar. He was 67 years old and had the specific dignified bearing of a man who has stood in front of congregations for 32 years and who is not accustomed to being addressed in that register. He had said, "Good morning. I'm Reverend Tatum. I'm the pastor of this church. The van isn't mine. The driver has gone back inside for a moment. If you'll give me a moment, I'll have someone get him." Pruitt had said, "I need you to step back from the steps." Tatum had said, "I stand on these steps every Sunday after the service. I'm greeting my congregation." Pruitt had said, "I need you to move." Tatum had said, "Officer, I want to be clear. I am the senior pastor of Greater Calvary AME Church. I have been the pastor here for 32 years. I stand on these steps every Sunday morning. My congregation is still exiting the building." He had gestured toward the doors behind him from which 2 more members of the congregation were at that moment emerging. Pruitt had reached forward and grabbed his arm and shoved him back toward the door. It was not a hard shove in the sense that it was not designed to knock him down. It was a shove in the sense that a 24-year-old officer's hand made forceful contact with a 67-year-old pastor's chest and arm and propelled him backward, and Marcus Tatum's shoulder hit the doorframe, and he put his hand out against the door and steadied himself. He did not fall. He steadied himself on the doorframe, and in the half-second of steadying, he thought several things simultaneously, which was the specific quality of a crisis moment, that he was not hurt, that his congregation was watching, that the officer was 24 years old and had just done something he did not understand the full weight of that. The response this moment required was not the response that his body was generating, that his father had prepared him for this precise kind of moment 40 years ago, without knowing that this precise kind of moment would come. He turned back to face the officer. He said nothing. He said nothing because 32 years of pastoral work had taught him the specific discipline of saying nothing in the moments when nothing is the correct thing to say, and because his father had taught him the same thing 40 years before that, and because this was a moment when nothing was the correct thing. The nothing he said was not passive. It was a form of presence that required as much from him as any sermon he had ever preached, possibly more, because a sermon is prepared in advance, and this was not prepared. This was real time. This was his shoulder against the doorframe and his hand on the door, and the congregation watching, and the officer standing there, and the specific discipline of remaining still and present and correct in a moment that required all 3 of those things simultaneously. He had managed it, but there were 43 members of his congregation on the steps, and in the parking lot, and on the sidewalk, who had seen what had happened, and they were not saying nothing. Deacon Harold Bridges had been on the steps. He had been at Marcus Tatum's right side when Pruitt approached, and he had heard the exchange, and he had seen the shove, and he had taken 1 step forward and said, in the specific measured register of a 71-year-old deacon who has been present at Greater Calvary for 28 years, and who has some experience with the regulation of his own reaction in the face of provocation. That is Reverend Marcus Tatum. He has been the senior pastor of this church for 32 years. He stands on these steps every Sunday morning. This is his church. He had said it loudly enough for the people in the parking lot to hear it. Choir director Vanessa Polk had come through the door at that moment and had stopped at the top of the steps and had said nothing but had looked at the officer with the specific look of a woman who has been directing the choir at Greater Calvary AME for 19 years and who is not easily intimidated. Sister Estelle Norwood was on the sidewalk. She had turned at the sound of Bridges's voice. She was 78 years old and had been a member of Greater Calvary since she was 37 years old, which was 41 years, and she was older than the officer's parents and possibly older than his grandparents, and she looked at him with the look of a woman who had seen a great deal in 78 years and who was looking at one more thing. Pruitt looked at the assembled congregation. He looked at the man in the clerical collar who had steadied himself against the door and who was looking at him without anger, which was a thing Pruitt had not expected. He had stepped back. He had gotten into his cruiser and driven away. Theodore Hicks had come out of the church 45 seconds later with the casserole dish. Marcus Tatum had stood on the steps for another 22 minutes after Pruitt drove away. Those 22 minutes were the most important 22 minutes of that day, and possibly of that week, and possibly of that month. They were important in the specific way that a continuation is important when the continuation is not obvious, when the interruption has happened, and the interruption was visible, and the question of what comes next is answered not with a statement, but with the resumption of the thing that was interrupted. He had resumed. He stood on the steps, and he greeted his congregation, and he was present to each person who came through the door in the same way he was always present, which was completely and specifically. He asked about Margaret Sister Norwood's daughter in Cleveland. He asked Theodore Hicks whether the casserole dish had survived the trip. He told the two young people who were leaving for new positions in other cities that they were going to be fine, and that Greater Calvary would hold their chair. He did all of these things while being the man who had just been shoved against a door on his own church steps, which was a thing that required its own form of discipline. He had greeted every remaining member of the congregation. He had said, "I'm fine," to the 7 or 8 people who said something about what had happened. He had said, "I'm fine, and we can talk about it," to Deacon Bridges, who was the last person on the steps. They had gone inside and sat in the front pew, which was where they sat when they needed to talk about something that required the specific quiet privacy of an empty sanctuary. Marcus had said, "I'm going to file a formal complaint. I'm going to need the congregation's witness statements if people are willing to give them." Bridges had said they'll give them, all of them. He had said that with a certainty that Marcus had recognized as accurate. Bridges had known this congregation for 28 years. He knew who would give a statement, and he knew that all of them would give one, which was a thing that was not always true of witnesses to an incident. People had reasons not to, some of them legitimate. Some of them fear, some of them the specific, exhausting calculation that many black people in America made about whether the formal process was worth the cost of engaging with it. Marcus had known that his congregation would not make that calculation in that direction, not because they were not tired. They were tired in the way that a community is tired when it has been doing the work of existing in the face of the country's particular history for a very long time. But they had been coming to Greater Calvary AME Church for decades, and they had been watching Reverend Marcus Tatum stand on those steps every Sunday morning, and they had watched a 24-year-old officer put his hands on him on those steps, and they were going to say what they had seen. They had said it, 23 written statements in 48 hours. Bridges had collected them at the door the following Sunday at a table he had set up in the narthex with the forms he had prepared, and he had passed out pens to people who did not have them, and he had collected the completed statements in a folder, and had numbered them in the order they were received. Bridges had been a logistics manager for 18 years before he retired. The statements were organized and numbered and indexed. Marcus had said, "I want to do it correctly, not quickly, correctly." Bridges had said, "I know." Marcus had said, "And I want to preach Sunday." Bridges had said, "You always preach Sunday." Marcus had said, I mean, I want to preach the next Sunday as if this Sunday was an ordinary Sunday, because it was." Bridges had looked at him. Marcus had said, "An officer put his hands on me on my own church steps. That is worth filing a complaint about. It is not worth letting it become the center of what we do here. The center of what we do here is what we do here." Bridges had said yes. Marcus had said, "So we file the complaint and we let the process work, and I preach Sunday." He had stood up. He had gone to his study. He had sat at the oak desk that had been in the study since Reverend Douglas's tenure, and he had made notes for the following Sunday's sermon. The sermon was going to be about thresholds. He had not yet decided whether to call it the steps. He thought he might. He sat at the desk for a long time that evening writing notes. The specific practice of the threshold, the 101 years of the building, his grandfather's $400, the way a congregation becomes over time the accumulated knowledge of a place. He thought about what it meant to stand on the steps. He had stood on those steps 1,664 times, and each time had been the same action performed in a different context. The context being the specific Sunday that it was, the specific congregation that had come out through the door, the specific Harmon County season and weather and light, and the specific weight that the week had carried before it arrived at Sunday morning. He had greeted people on those steps who were carrying grief so fresh they had not yet given it a name, and people who were carrying joy that they had not yet had a chance to share with anyone, and people who were carrying the ordinary accumulated weight of a life being lived, which was its own kind of heaviness. He had been the one standing there. He had been the one available to receive whatever it was they were carrying in the moment of crossing from the church back into the street. That was what the threshold was for. That was what he was going to preach about. He closed his notebook. He was ready. Deacon Bridges had filed the church's incident report in the church's incident log that afternoon. The log was a hardbound ledger that he maintained as part of his deacon responsibilities, which included recording significant events in the church's administrative and community life. He had recorded the date, the time, the description of the incident, the names of the 43 congregants present, and a notation that he was beginning the process of collecting formal witness statements. He had collected 23 written witness statements within 48 hours. The statements had a specific quality that came from being written by people who had been in one place for a long time and who knew exactly what they had seen and who were describing it to a formal record. Sister Estelle Norwood's statement was one paragraph written in the careful longhand of a woman who had been a secretary for 30 years before she retired. It said, "I have known Reverend Marcus Tatum for 30 years. I have seen him on those steps every Sunday for 30 years. I saw the officer grab him and push him back against the door. Reverend Tatum did not do anything that would have given anyone a reason to put their hands on him. He was standing on the steps of his church greeting his congregation. That is what he does on those steps. That is what he has always done." Vanessa Polk's statement described the moment she came through the door and saw Tatum steadying himself against the door frame, and described the clerical collar and the cross, and said, "Anyone who looked at that man could see what he was. He was the pastor of that church. He was wearing the collar." Deacon Bridges filed the 23 statements with the church's formal complaint to the Harmon County Sheriff's Department's Internal Affairs Division. He also filed a complaint with the AME District Superintendent, which was the denominational oversight body for Greater Calvary. The AME District Superintendent was a man named Bishop Gerald Watts, who had been the bishop of the Harmon County AME District for 11 years. He had known Marcus Tatum for those 11 years and had read the church's complaint within an hour of receiving it. He had called Marcus that evening. Marcus had said, "I'm fine. The complaint has been filed." The congregation gave statements. The bishop had said, "Do you need anything from the district?" Marcus had said, "I need the district to file its own formal complaint with the department. I need the full weight of the denominational structure in the record." The bishop had said, "It'll be filed tomorrow morning." Marcus had said, "Thank you." He had hung up. He had called Raymond and Amani. Raymond had said, "Dad." Marcus had said, "I'm fine. I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." Raymond had said, "Did he?" Marcus had said, "I'm fine." I steadied myself. I did not fall. There was a silence. Raymond had said, "What do you need?" Marcus had said, "Nothing right now. Come to church Sunday if you can." Raymond had said, "We'll be there." Imani had answered from Atlanta on the first ring. She had said, "Dad, I just saw something online." He had said, "I'm fine. I want to tell you what happened." He had told her. She had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "You didn't fall." He had said, "I didn't fall." She had said, "Good." There was a pause. She had said, "Dad, you know what that means." He had known what she meant. She had not explained it. She was 35 years old, and she had been his daughter for 35 years, and she had grown up in the south side of Harmon County, and she had grown up in Greater Calvary, AME Church, and she had grown up watching her father stand on those steps every Sunday morning, and she knew what it meant that he had steadied himself and turned back and remained on the steps. She had not needed to explain it, and she had not explained it. She had said, "I'm coming this weekend." He had said, "You don't need to." She had said, "I know I don't need to. I'm coming." He had said, "Then come." The complaint was assigned to the department's Internal Affairs Division and was reviewed by a lieutenant named Renee Ashworth, who had been with the department for 19 years. She was the kind of investigator who read the complaint documentation before she looked at the footage, because she wanted the documentation to establish her frame of reference before the footage provided the visual record, so that she was reading the footage against the documented account, rather than building the documented account around what the footage showed. She read Deacon Bridges's incident log. She read the 23 witness statements. She read the AME, District Superintendent's formal complaint. She read the Harmon County Human Rights Commission complaint, which had been filed separately by a civil rights attorney who was a member of the congregation. Then she looked at the body cam footage. The body cam footage showed the corner of Clement Street at 1223. It showed the front steps of Greater Calvary, AME Church. It showed the sign on the building that said, "Greater Calvary, African Methodist Episcopal Church, established 1923. It showed a man in a clerical collar with a silver cross at the collar standing on the steps. She noted that the clerical collar was visible from the moment Pruitt approached. She noted that the cross at the collar was visible. She noted that the sign on the building was readable. She noted that Tatum had identified himself as the pastor before any physical contact occurred, and that the identification had been verbal, had included the name of the church, and had been delivered calmly and without any behavior that would have constituted a threat. She noted that the physical contact occurred after the verbal identification. She noted that the body cam showed Tatum's shoulder contact with the door frame. She noted that at the moment of contact, 26 members of the congregation were visibly present in the frame on the steps in the parking lot on the sidewalk. She had looked at that number for a moment. 26 people visible in the frame. 23 had given written statements. The statements were consistent. She had been doing this work for 19 years, and consistent witness statements from 23 people who were in different positions relative to the incident and who had written their statements independently over a 48-hour period were not common. They were consistent because they were describing the same thing, and the thing they were describing was what the body cam footage also showed. She continued reviewing the footage. She also reviewed the dash-mounted camera footage from Pruitt's cruiser, which provided a wider angle and showed the Clement Street scene from the vehicle's perspective. The dash footage showed the church's sign clearly from the moment Pruitt turned onto Clement Street. It showed the front of the building. It showed the congregation still exiting through the front doors. She considered the sequence. She considered the sign. She considered the clerical collar. She considered the verbal identification. She considered the physical contact that followed the verbal identification. She conducted her investigation in 14 days. The findings unprovoked use of physical force against a civilian who had not engaged in any behavior providing a basis for physical contact. Sustained. Failure to recognize and respond appropriately to occupational and contextual identification. The clerical collar. The church signed the verbal identification as pastor before initiating physical engagement. Sustained. Pruitt received a 40-day suspension without pay and a formal letter of reprimand. Per department policy, a formal apology to the affected civilian was required following a sustained force finding, in which the civilian had not been charged with any offense. The apology was delivered in writing and submitted to the file. Pruitt's immediate supervisor received a counseling notation for failure to adequately monitor a new officer in the field, which was a notation that meant less than a sustained finding, but more than nothing. The department's training division added a new element to the officer orientation curriculum: contextual identification protocols. The element covered the specific recognition of occupational identifiers in the field: clerical attire postal uniforms, medical identification trade uniforms, and the required assessment before any escalation in response to a non-emergency call. The element was mandatory for all incoming officers. It was also added as a refresher component for officers in their first 2 years of field assignment. The element included a specific case study drawn without named parties from the Greater Calvary incident. An officer responds to a non-emergency call, observes a man at a place of worship in full clerical attire, receives a verbal identification from the man as the building's religious leader, and proceeds to physical contact without any assessment of the available information. The case study was written to be clear about what information was available and what use was made of it. The department's training coordinator had asked Lieutenant Ashworth whether she wanted to be credited as the case study's author. She had said no. Put it in the curriculum without a name. The point is the lesson. Lieutenant Ashworth filed her completed report. She had noted at the end of the report that the incident had occurred in front of 43 witnesses, that 23 of them had provided written statements, and that the statements had been consistent in every material detail, which was a thing that rarely happened in civilian witness accounts of fast-moving incidents, and which she had noted as a fact of the record. 43 people had seen the same thing. They had said so in writing. Marcus Tatum was informed of the investigation's findings in a letter from the Internal Affairs Division, which arrived on a Wednesday. He read it at the desk in his study, the oak desk from Reverend Douglas's tenure. He read it once. He read it once because the first reading was sufficient. He had been in the pastoral work long enough to have learned that most documents that matter can be understood in a single careful reading, and that subsequent readings are usually a form of delay, a way of not yet doing what you know you need to do with what you have read. He understood what the letter said. He understood what the findings meant. He understood what came next, which was nothing more complicated than going to prepare Sunday's sermon, which was the thing that came after every Wednesday, regardless of what the Wednesday contained. He put it in the file that Deacon Bridges had organized for the documentation from the incident: the church's incident log entry, the 23 witness statements, the denominational complaint, the Human Rights Commission complaint, the bishop's letter, the letters from Raymond and Imani, and now the investigation's findings. He sat at the desk for a few minutes after he put the letter in the file. He thought about his grandfather Ezra, who had been 34 years old when he signed the charter for Greater Calvary AME Church in March of 1923. Who had put $400 of foundry wages into the building fund, who had been a deacon of the church for 48 years. He thought about what it meant to stand on the steps of a building that his grandfather had helped found, and to have someone put his hands on him there and tell him to move. He thought about the fact that he had not moved. He had steadied himself against the doorframe, and he had turned back, and he had said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing. And then he had stood on the steps for 22 more minutes, and greeted the rest of his congregation. He thought about Celestine, who would have said exactly what she would have said, which was something he did not need to guess at because he had known her for 36 years, and he still knew her, which was the specific, continuing knowledge of a person that did not stop when the person stopped. She would have said, "You didn't fall." He would have said, "I didn't fall." She would have said, "Good." She would have said something else after that was very specific to Celestine and that he did not need to write down because he would never forget it. He stood up. He went to prepare for Sunday. The following Sunday, he preached on the theme of thresholds. He had called the sermon "The Steps." He had not mentioned the incident directly. He had not mentioned Officer Dylan Pruitt or the Harmon County Sheriff's Department or the complaint or the investigation or the findings. He had preached about what thresholds mean. He had preached about the specific pastoral practice of standing at the threshold between the sacred and the ordinary, and about what it means to make yourself available at the place of crossing, and about the 101-year history of Greater Calvary AME Church, standing on Clement Street as a threshold, a place where the people of this community could cross from the street into something that held them. He had preached about Ezra Tatum, who had signed the charter in 1923, and who had put $400 of foundry wages into the building fund, and who had stood in this building for 48 years, and who had died at 82, with the specific, settled satisfaction of a man who had spent his life building something that would outlast him. He had said, "My grandfather did not build this building so that it could be a place that someone tells you to leave. He built it so that it could be a place you come back to every Sunday, all the Sundays you have left. He built it so that the door is always the same door, and the steps are always the same steps, and the people on the steps are always the people who have been here before, and who are going to be here after, and who are holding the threshold for everyone who has not yet arrived." He had not said, "And I was shoved on those steps last Sunday." He had not said it because the sermon was not about what happened to him. The sermon was about what the steps were for, and what the steps were for was not about him. The steps were about the 101 years of people who had stood on them, and the people who were going to stand on them after him, and the people who were going to come through the door and need what was on the other side of it. He had preached about Ezra Tatum, who had signed the charter in 1923, and who had put $400 of foundry wages into the building fund, and who had stood in this building for 48 years. He had said, "We have been on this threshold for 101 years. We are going to be on it for 101 more. The threshold does not move because someone tells it to move. The threshold stays." Raymond was in the second pew with his wife and the two grandchildren, Celestine and Harold. Harold was 4 now, and Celestine was 6, and they sat with the specific, well-behaved energy of children who had been going to church their whole lives, and who understood that certain things were required of them in this building, and who provided them. Imani was in from Atlanta. She was sitting next to Raymond, and he could see from the pulpit that she had been crying during some portion of the sermon which she would not mention, and he would not ask about. Sister Estelle Norwood was in the second pew on the left side, which was where she had sat for 41 years. Deacon Bridges was in the deacon's section. Vanessa Polk was with the choir. The congregation was full in the specific way that a congregation becomes full when it has absorbed something difficult and has come back the following week to be together in the place where the difficult thing happened, because the place is not diminished by what happened in it. A building that has been standing on a corner for 101 years has held a great many difficult things. This was one more. After the service, Marcus Tatum walked to the back of the church and through the narthex and out through the front doors and down the 3 steps to the place where he stood every Sunday. He stood there. He greeted his congregation as they came out. He was still standing there when Sister Estelle Norwood came through the door, because she always came out first, because she sat in the second pew on the left side and she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped at the top of the steps. She looked at him on the bottom step. She said, "Good morning, Reverend." He said, "Good morning, Estelle." She said, "Same spot." He said, "Same spot." She went down the steps and onto the sidewalk and turned toward home. He stood on the steps. He had been standing here for 32 years. He had stood here the Sunday after Celestine died, and the Sunday after his father died, and the Sunday after the diagnosis, and the Sunday after the investigation's letter arrived, and this Sunday. He was going to stand here next Sunday. The light on Clement Street in October had the specific low quality of October in Harmon County, the warm, late afternoon quality that made the building's brick look a particular color, and that made the shadows of the oak trees on the sidewalk long and distinct. His grandfather Ezra had stood in the October light on this street. His grandfather had been 34 years old when the charter was signed, and 82 years old when he died, and he had given 48 years of himself to this threshold. Marcus had given 32. He had a lot of Sundays left. He was going to keep giving them. He was going to keep standing on the steps. The congregation was going to keep coming through the door and down the steps and into the October light, and he was going to be here when they did, and the door was going to be behind him, and the building was going to be behind the door, and the 101 years of the building was going to be behind all of it, and none of that was going to change because someone had told him to move. He had not moved. He was not going to move. He stayed on the steps until the last member of the congregation had come through the door. The last person was Harold, his grandson, who was 4 years old, and who had come back through the door because he had left his small Bible in the pew, and who came down the steps holding it, and who looked up at his grandfather with the specific 4-year-old directness of a child who does not yet know how to be indirect. Harold had said, "Grandpa, why are you still out here?" Marcus had said, "This is where I stand." Harold had thought about this. Harold had said every Sunday. Marcus had said every Sunday. Harold had looked at the steps, and at the street, and at the building behind them with the specific serious face of a 4-year-old who is processing information and who is not yet sure what to do with it. Then he had gone down the steps and taken his father's hand because Raymond was waiting at the bottom, and because Raymond was where he was going, which was fine, because Raymond was right there, and the steps would be here next Sunday too. Marcus had watched them go. He had watched Raymond and his grandson Harold walk down the Clement Street sidewalk toward the parking lot, and he had watched Imani follow them, and he had stood on the steps until they had rounded the corner. Then he went back inside. He had work to do. He always had work to do. The work was the point, and the threshold was the point, and this building on this street in this county was where both of those things lived, and he was going to be here for as long as both of them required him, which was a long time, which was fine. He had a lot of Sundays left.